On June 15th, 2017, police walked into the Stockdale residence to find Catherine and James Stockdale fatally shot. When police arrived on the scene, they heard a single gunshot. When they entered the home, they found Jacob Stockdale bleeding from a gunshot wound to the head. So how do we get here? Hello, I'm your host Stacy, and welcome back to How Did We Get Here, where we talk about some of the craziest cases throughout history and ask ourselves, how did we get here? Today we'll be talking about Jacob Stockdale and what has been nicknamed the wife swap murders. So if you've never heard of the show Wife Swap, it was a pretty popular reality TV show in the 2000s to 2010s. The premise was fairly simple. You take two families with very different lifestyles and you have them swap the wives/mothers of the family. For 1 week, the moms would have to live by the rules of that other family, and for the second week, they were allowed to change the rules and have the families experience a more similar lifestyle to their own. And obviously this gets very messy, very crazy, and it makes for great entertainment and great reality TV because it took the classic fish out of water approach. So now that we're all caught up with what wife swap is, let's visit the 2008 episode with the Stockdale and Tonovic families. It featured the Stockdale family from Ohio and the Tonovic family from Illinois. And obviously, in the spirit of the show, they were completely different families. So the Tonovic family was Lori, the wife, her husband John, and their children Paul, or the entire episode they call him T-Vic because he's a rapper, and Megan, their daughter. They were definitely the more laid back, easygoing, the fun parents, the cool parents. They spent a lot of more money. They let their kids get fast food all the time and gave their kids a lot of freedom. Their older kids, boyfriends and girlfriends even lived inside of the home with them. Lori went over to the Stockdale family house in Stark County, Ohio, with Kathy, her husband Timothy, and their sons Calvin, Charles, Jacob, and James. And Lori thought their family was way too strict, and you'll see why pretty easily. The Stockdales pretty much lived in seclusion. They moved away from the city because Kathy and Timothy wanted to get their sons away from the bad influences of the world. In the beginning of each episode, when the wives switch, they have a book or a manual that they create for the new wife so they can read about the rules of the house. And when Lori sat down to read Kathy's book, she looked at it and thought that they were insanely strict on their kids. So in Kathy's book, she said, quote, "We moved to the country to get the boys away from violent language, sexual influences, drinking, smoking, drugs, rap music, and all the things we left behind in the city. Instead, we raise our children on a diet of wholesome activities and farm work, keeping their minds and bodies healthy and keeping out the influences of modern society." Unquote. The boys weren't allowed to really have any contact with the outside world. The boys weren't even allowed to date, which included the older boys who were about 19 at this point. They weren't allowed to watch TV. They weren't allowed to listen to rap or secular music, as she would call it. They couldn't eat candy. They couldn't even really listen to the radio, except for specific radio shows. And in order to even do that, they would have to work and or earn it through their chores. Their chores would get tokens, and their tokens would pay for the things that they wanted to do. The only thing that they really did for fun was their family bluegrass band. Kathy believed in order for her kids to be successful in life, they needed to have a good work ethic and a lot of structure. So their dad and the kids all played instruments in this bluegrass band while their mom was their manager. And they were relatively successful. They even traveled around the country, competed in competitions, and made 3 albums. Kathy wanted her kids to be busy at all times. She believed in order for them to be successful in life, they needed to have a good work ethic and a lot of structure. But weirdly enough, these boys weren't even allowed to play sports because their parents thought that it would make them too self-centered and competitive. They were homeschooled, so Kathy could have complete control over what they were taught and what morals they were learning. So during week 2 of the Tonovic wife swap, Lori decides she's going to change a lot of the rules and allow the boys to have a lot more freedom. But even this, the boys were very uncomfortable with. When Lori allowed the boys to play video games, Jacob actually ran out of the room crying, telling Lori that his parents told him that if he played video games, he would burn in hell. So he was highly uncomfortable. And again, when she allowed the older boys to date, they did not want to because they believed they would go to hell. On the other side of the coin, at the Tonovic family house, when Kathy decided to change the rules, she wanted to teach Lori's kids a lesson, and she had them and their significant others carry around babies, have them carry around the babies that would like cry and you have to change their diapers, so she could teach them the responsibilities about having a kid. And at the end of this episode, when the two wives finally met, it didn't go very well, and Lori actually ended up calling Catherine a terrible parent. So the Stockdale kids were actually allowed to leave once they were college age, but it was highly discouraged. So Calvin and Charles eventually left home to go to college, and Jacob and James were left with their parents by themselves. They were still playing in the bluegrass band, and Jacob actually joined a second band and was winning a lot of competitions. And everything was normal, at least in terms of the Stockdale family, until that day of June 15, 2017, when a 911 call was placed, but the caller hung up before ever stating their emergency. So police tracked the call back to the Stockdale residence and sent out a squad car with 2 sheriff deputies. When they got there, the front door was left open, and when they looked inside, they saw someone lay motionless on the floor. They call commands and tell the person to put their hands up, hoping that they would just stand up. But they don't, and they don't hear a response until they hear a gunshot go off in the house. So they go into the house and see Catherine Stockdale laying on the floor. They also see the youngest son, James Stockdale. They were both dead from a gunshot wound. When they go further into the house, they find Jacob with a gunshot wound to the head, but he was still alive. Police knew that they walked into a attempted double murder suicide. So Jacob was taken to the Metro Health Medical Center to be treated for his life-threatening injuries. So in a press conference, police said that they had no reason to suspect that something like this would have ever happened before. Police had never been called to their residence, and after talking to Timothy's father, they could not think of any motive. So while Jacob was in critical care, Calvin and Charles and their father were alerted about what had happened. Charles put out a public statement saying that James was the catalyst for family fun, a gifted musician, loved dancing people, and was planning to work on a business degree so he could go into business entertainment, and was leaving behind a family that loved him. So at this point, Jacob was expected to make a full recovery. The community donated $14,000 to a GoFundMe to help raise money for their memorial service. Eventually, when this was open to the public, it reached over $31,000 and was also used to help pay Jacob's medical expenses, which was obviously very controversial in the community because of what Jacob had done. Jacob needed medical care for over a year to be able to recover from his self-inflicted gunshot wound. Charge Jacob with anything. They had to wait for his condition to improve and then before then trying to determine a motive. But in October of 2018, Jacob had heard about the indictment by a grand jury himself, so he decided to turn himself into the Stark County Sheriff's Office. Jacob pleaded non-guilty by reason of insanity and was placed in a mental institution for more observation. While Jacob was under observation at this institution, Dr. Arcangela Wood determined that Jacob was clinically sane, was able to stand trial, and was capable of understanding court proceedings. So Jacob and his team asked for a second opinion, and this doctor said that there would actually be cause for concern and that he might not be competent for trial now, but he could most likely be restored in a year. Jacob's team then asked for a third opinion, but they were denied because of how much tax money it would cost. That's when Jacob stayed at another mental institution, but he tried to escape on several attempts. In November of 2019, Jacob tried to escape by hiding behind a stack of books that were being moved in and out of the hospital. Obviously, he was caught before he could escape the building, because that hasn't even worked in TV shows. Why would it work in real life? And then a month later, he tried to disguise himself and hide within a crowd of people and tried to escape the institution. But again, he was very quickly discovered before he could even make it out the door. And to Jacob's demise, because of these escapes, the judge deemed him competent. If you can plan out these escapes, then you can probably listen to the court hearings. So his sanity trial was first scheduled for March of 2020, but we all know what happened March of 2020, and the entire world was in lockdown. So then it got pushed to September 8th of 2020, when we all thought we would be living life normally again, but we weren't. So Jacob was actually teleconferenced into the hearing from the medical center. And throughout the hearing, Jacob didn't respond or acknowledge the judge at all, and it was starting to become an issue. And that's when his attorney began speaking for him and telling the judge that Jacob had difficulty processing and speaking when it came to technology, and even had some fear. And this is actually not a very far-fetched idea, considering what we know from the wife swap episode. Jacob was so terrified of video games because he thought he was going to hell. He had it ingrained in him since he was a child. If he in any way was communicating with the outside world, that he was going to burn. So it is not that crazy to think that this ideology was still in him as an adult. But Jacob was found to be mentally sane. Trial date was postponed again and again, all the way back to May of 2021. The rest of the Stockdale family actually asked the judge to give him leniency. But Jacob eventually pleaded guilty to the murders of his mother and brother, and he was charged with 2 15-year sentences, one for each murder, so for a total of 30 years in prison. The Stockdale family actually won't really speak about this case, and Jacob never gave his motive for why he did what he did. But we can all make an educated guess, and Lori from the Wife Swap episode even came out and said that she believes that the lack of free will that these kids had eventually caused Jacob to snap. She said that the boy's inability to even make their own decisions and that strict lifestyle eventually caught up to him. And personally, I think she's right. These parents restricted to their kids to a point that I would consider inhumane. One of the kids even had like a broom as his friend because he wasn't allowed to talk to anybody else. At the end of the day, even though these parents were trying to do what was best for their children, they set them up for failure. This was a lifestyle that even themselves did not live. So why they thought their kids would benefit from this, I don't know. The parents are to blame. I think that Jacob was in a restrictive lifestyle. He was not allowed to do anything. I think over the years, he built up pent-up aggression, and he took it out on his mom, the person who was doing this to him, and his brother, who just happened to be an innocent bystander in all of this. But this case makes me not only question the parents, but I do question Wife Swap. I actually did watch Wife Swap quite a bit. When it was out, me and my mom would watch it a lot. And during the pandemic, I did go back and watch quite a bit of the episodes. And there are so many, not cases that ended up in murder, but just families with very strict backgrounds where it is pretty much abusive, where I'm think to myself, there was an entire production team, camera crew, producers that sat and watched what was going on to these kids, and not a single person did anything. If we went back and somebody on that team said something, did something, we probably wouldn't be where we are today. The kids would probably have some sort of freedom. Jacob wouldn't have felt the need to murder his mother. But there are so many situations where the parents will quite literally admit to abuse. There's an episode where the parents literally hung belts outside of their kids' rooms to threaten them that if you did anything wrong, this is what's waiting for you. And nobody did anything. And that's actually so crazy to me. And look at where we are now with the Stockdale family. But thank you for joining me on this week's episode of How Did We Get Here? And be sure to tune in next week where we'll look at another crazy case throughout history and ask ourselves, how did we get here?